Welcome to the Confident Grief Coach Show.
Hi, I am Pat Shevland, founder of the Confident Grief Coach School.
And I'm Cami Thielander, Advanced Certified Grief Coach and founder of Embodied Grief Support Coaching.
We believe as professionals, it is important to have a forum where we can gather as a community to really talk about all things body, mind, and spirit when it comes to grief.
We will be sharing stories, discussing thought-provoking ideas, and interviewing others who work in the field of grief and those who have the lived experience of creating lives of peace and purpose after experiencing deep loss.
Information about Cami's Embodied Grief Support Coaching Services or the Confident Grief Coach Certification Program can be found in our show notes below.
Thank you for joining us at the Confident Grief Coach Show. And if you like what you're hearing or would like us to focus on a specific topic in the future, please hit the like and subscribe button to stay connected. Hello, Pat.
Hi, Cami. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing well. It's sunny out here and the weather's warming up in Minnesota, so it's starting to finally feel like springtime.
Oh, let's
How
hope
are
so.
you?
Let's hope so. Springtime, yeah, is just like so. The whole eclipse yesterday was like, oh, and living in Minnesota also, it's like, oh, it's so cloudy and no eclipse, but it's like, but I've seen eclipses before, but couldn't really remember when, and remembered that it wasn't that magical for us when my husband and I we were like, yeah, we kind of remember it. I don't know if it was a moon, but I have no idea. But
Kind of an intense energy the last couple weeks. I don't know if you've been feeling any of that,
yes,
but I
yes,
have.
very much so. I feel like, yeah, things are, um, yeah, yeah, there's a lot of energy going around and trying to just get settled in. And I read something yesterday which really helped me, and it said, during the first half of the eclipse, as it's moving towards it, the full eclipse, think about things that maybe you want to release that, are no longer serving you and what you can release. Maybe it's finished, make sure that it's finished and be very intentional about that. And then as you go into that last hour or so during, after the eclipse, very intentional about what it is you want to bring in. And not just, I want to be happy or that type of thing, but really intentional. What does that look like for you? And so, yeah, so I had some of that. And then I did a little yoga nidra during the eclipse time frame and felt like,
Mm,
oh yeah, I feel like I'm pretty grounded now.
that's awesome. That's awesome. What do you want to bring in? What are your intentions?
Well, fully full immersion into what I do in the grief coaching and educating space. Of course, this is my love, my heart. I'm going to be 66 this summer, so it really is taking a look at my intentionality of where I'm spending my time. And my health has like not been the best with this back pain that I've been kind of dealing with for about 8 months. And it's like, nope, I am going to create full healing physically and have joy. I want to be smiling all the time. I want to enjoy life while doing what this is what my servant's heart wants to do is all this with grief. So yeah, what about you?
Oh, I feel like I'm at the very beginning of a lot of projects that I'm diving into, and same thing with like I love the grief space and being fully immersed in that. Yet, how do I find that balance of taking care of myself and meeting my needs so that I can show up with a smile on my face and with that energy that is required to show up for people that are not, you know, addressing life with a smile on their face at the moment to think about, okay, well, how can I best show up to support them? And that means that I need to show up for me. So I've been taking a lot of self-care and reevaluating what my role looks like in the grief work and yeah, how to better show up for my grieving inner child that shows up, in
Yep.
this role as well. So with that in mind, just with this immersion and with just grief and joy and the inner child and all of that, you mentioned that you were at a grief camp recently, and I would love if you could share more about what that experience was like.
Oh, yes. So for about the past This was probably my 22nd camp that I volunteered at. And for a while, I was on the board of directors. It's called Healing Hearts Connection, which is a nonprofit based out of Minnesota, where we provide free camps for grieving kids and their families, school-age kids and their families, to come and actually be immersed into a camp environment. So just finished that this weekend. So went up Friday and worked with the volunteers to get everything set up and prepared for the families to come bright and early Saturday morning. And then we have this programming from the minute they enter the door, very intentionalized programming for the kids and for the adult, the family members. And so this time we kind of switch up so that we have lots of experience in various areas. But I was back being the director of the family camp this time, at which I hadn't been for a while. I'd been doing other things around the camp, and it was really, really powerful to step back into that. And for me, that was the adults and how extremely scary it is to have them not be with their kiddos for part of the programming, right? And we do have them encourage them to sleep apart so that mom and dad or grandma or whoever is the guardian caregiver actually can have their own space to grieve and do their own processing, and also have the children have theirs. And the kids are put together by developmental age groups, which is super cool. So you got these little tiny, like 6-year-olds and that type of thing, little bugs, they call them, up to teens and emerging adults and everything in between. And every group has like a different energy to it, right? The littles are so darn cute and just have some interesting questions, but how we talk about death, dying, dead, that type of thing, very intentional with that. And I noticed, like, with the adults, we do some panel discussions, and we do the programming is similar in both the children and the adults, but with the adults, it's like they cringe when you talk about death, dead, dying. And we explain to them that we're very intentional about that with the children, because going away, they went away, or they went to heaven, they went to a place. And we had a conversation about heaven, because one of the family members was talking about, well, our children were told, that daddy went to heaven. And as we talked about that, heaven is a place. And so these littles are like, but then you can come back from it. Right. And so not that you shouldn't have those conversations, but death, knowing that death, dying, dead, even littles understand what that means. At 5, you understand what that means, that it's not coming back. We're not going to come back to life, so to speak. So there's just like so much there, but I guess my biggest, you talked about the self-care and that type of thing, and we go in and the volunteers are just amazing, and they come from all walks of life. Everybody's had some type of lived experience. A lot of people who have gone on to become counselors, social workers, clergy, that type of thing. Myself, just we're working in the space of grief. And then you had some younger people come that they're just exploring, like, oh, my stepdad died, so my sister and I came to, just help out and do that. And we put everything in and get everything ready Friday night. And then Saturday is just like so much. We packed so much in. And then we're finally done around 1:00, noon, 1:00, where we have a final lunch, and then they all disperse. And as we're sitting around in our debriefing circle yesterday, no, the day before, Sunday, it's like you could just look around and everybody's like, because you have expended so much energy to support and hold the space for these families and these kiddos that someone who is a chaplain, he said, or someone said, just make sure you fill your own cup. Now it's time to
Mhm.
go back and fill your own cup. So, yeah, but it's cool.
Yeah, I have experienced two grief camps where I had the opportunity to volunteer and be a facilitator with some kiddos. And I had a couple groups. One was they were pretty young. I think between 7 and 9 years old. And I remember, yeah, like going into those spaces and having these conversations. And at that age, it's like it's really cool to see how kids really do want to talk about death. They want to talk about their understanding of the situation. They like, from what I saw, for the most part, you know how adults filter all of, we have all these judgments and we have all these filters that come with grief and death and dying, but kids are just so honest and so present with their understanding of the reality of the situation that if you give them the opportunity, they're just gonna and just tell you everything
Yep.
about it, and they really want to. So for me, that was a really healing experience to see kids having the opportunity to do that with other kids who have, you know, similar but different experiences, to have that space to just to be real and honest about what this means to them and all of the challenges and all the emotions that they're feeling that come with it. And I can imagine how, from the parent's point of view or the guardian, how, especially if you have your own grief and you have a child who's grieving, how that relationship can get especially challenging when the whole family has grief, and how that can impact how the parent shows up for the child. And now here's someone like me who's a neutral space holder that can invite these conversations without, you know, my grief from the loss of, you know, their loved one, and how they just take it and run. They have that permission and they just express and they
Yep.
share all these stories. And it's really cool to see the openness around these conversations and the healing that can happen when we do hold that space.
Yeah. And with kids, you and I were briefly talking, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. Like, what can we be doing in those spaces where children are, like schools? Um, but they ask questions like, what does it mean, cremation? Tell me, they want to know the actual like act of what does that look like? Um, what does it mean when your heart stops? So they ask a lot of these really curious questions. Um, why do why do people die from drugs, you
Hmm.
know, when they're supposed to be helping us? So I mean, because that's what we don't understand is we forget as adults that when you have little ears around, they're picking it up, but
Mhm.
they're creating their own thoughts of what are some of those conversations that's maybe going on around them, and they don't have the context. So then they create their own, oh, that's what that means, right? Daddy went to heaven. Well, daddy will be coming back. Daddy will come back then. I wonder when daddy's coming back. That's nice that he went on a little trip. You know, how does he come back? And so sometimes and I think it's great as adults, though, we've put this layering of softening things, and it kind of shocks some of these family members when they hear the questions that their kids have been asking in their group, like, what? And we usually have someone that has worked in the funeral director space, and we have someone that understands medicals that we can explain about that, and then grief professionals, and so that we can really have some great conversations, but not too much for these kids. You give them too much and it's too much, and depending upon their age level. And I think also for the teenagers, for them to be with other teens, because when you go to school, and you probably experienced this at your young age when you went through both the deaths of both your dads, that there aren't a lot of people that have experienced that at your age. And so
Mhm.
when you go to school, it's like, well, I don't really have anybody that gets me. Whereas here, they become really connected with the peers that are in their sharing circles, because like, oh, you do know what it's like. I can
Mhm.
talk to you about this. and not have you look at me weird.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you said about like how as adults, there's often this layer of like softening of like naturally wanting to protect our kids from the harsh reality of life and death. And from my experience going through some adverse experiences when I was growing up in my household, you know, I was 11 when my dad died. And before that, my parents were going through a divorce, and there was just a lot of turmoil in the household that I could feel. My nervous system picked it up. I'm sensitive. I could sense that mommy and daddy's relationship wasn't happy. Yet the message and the story that I had been told the whole time was, no, everything's fine. We're good. We're okay. You know, like just go on and be a kid and do your thing. And I remember later in life how confusing that was now to
Mhm.
have these mixed messages of, well, you're telling me that everything's okay, yet I'm sensing this feeling like things are not okay. So that created a confusion with listening to the signals in my body and my sense of safety and my relationships with, you know, with people in the household in my family unit, and how not having that honesty about what was actually going on in order to protect me from the situation actually created a lot of confusion for my ability to process the change that was occurring. So I think about that a lot, and I wonder, what is that like line between what is too much developmentally for a kid depending on their age and depending on what's going on, because they're smart, they can feel, they understand, they have their own stories and their own process of making sense of the situation. Yet how can we bring some clarity and some honesty to help support them through that? And I think that can get tricky when, of course, there's this emotional charge and there's these cultural implications about how we shouldn't be talking about grief and death, and how we don't even say the D word. We talk about passing on or, yeah, going away, and how that can be really confusing if we don't have that honesty for kids.
Right.
Um, so I thought that's cool how that there was an open conversation around that at grief camp, and how we're able to kind of facilitate those conversations and bring some clarity and some openness around these topics that can be really confusing for kids.
Yep. And it is amazing because and then we're talking about that with their adults so that they in turn can have those conversations with the kid and understand it. And again, to do it in the right way, I am not a child psychologist or an expert in developmental things with a child. So you and I were briefly talking about what's happening in the schools, and I know someone else that, helps us in our leadership team is also an educator in the school systems. And I think, in order to create um, the appropriate tools and resources, they're going to need to be age appropriate,
Yeah.
from that perspective. But when you think about it, I've had so many people tell me that they went to counselors or therapists, and this is not a diss because counselors and therapists and people need this, and I will refer them on. But oftentimes they may not have the experience in talking about grief. They may be fairly new in their careers, whatever the case may be, and may not know how to support the family. And I just feel like educators in the school system would be the experts. Like, how do we work with them? We have the expertise in grief and can do some training, but they're the ones that would know how best to utilize it depending on the age group that we're
Mhm.
talking about.
Yeah, to make these big concepts and ideas and really important things to learn about life and death and grief and all of these emotional challenges that come with life that I feel like often are not addressed in school. How can we integrate more of those lessons and those conversations in a curriculum that actually is digestible for the kids in their age group and their development, and bringing that support into the school systems? Because yeah, I mean, that's where kids spend a large chunk of their time from day to day. Like that's a community and hopefully a safe space for them to show up with their grief and to show up with all the things that they're bringing from their home life now to this other part of their day. And for me, I mean, my experience, I was sixth grade. I was in the sixth grade, and it was January, so it was the middle of my this school year, where I was the new kid already. because I just moved into this town where my mom and stepdad bought a house together. So I was the new kid already and I didn't know anyone. And then my dad died halfway through the year. And my English teacher was really trying to be supportive and had my whole English class write me cards about their condolences, talking about, just, I'm so sorry you lost your dad. And I found these cards like few months ago and I was reading them and it was really touching. And how even that opportunity, I saw a lot of other sixth graders were like, wow, my cat died or my grandma died. And they were reflecting even just in these cards, even though they hardly knew me. But then when I returned back to school, it almost had this, I know it was intended to be supportive, yet when I returned back to school, there was still this lack of support from my peers now because now I was the new kid with the dead dad and everybody knew it and nobody knew how to hang out with me. So I felt even more isolated because I felt like I had been called out by my English teacher
Oh, yeah.
because she used this opportunity as an exercise for the English students to write cards, and I thought that was really sweet. And she showed up at my dad's funeral with all these cards, so it really was like a really awesome act of kindness that I remember. However, I remember returning back into school now, and it was like, yeah, no kids knew how to interact with me. I was kind of like avoided and shunned because it was like, we don't know how to relate to you anymore. So I think about those kinds of situations from sixth grade versus my stepdad died when I was 15 years old on the first day of my sophomore year of high school. And I went to school the next day because I was an academic student and I wanted to be good and go back to class. And, you don't want to miss the first day when you're learning your schedule and all of that. So I remember going back to school the day after my stepdad died and going up to each of my teachers and trying to explain to them why I missed the first day. So I'm standing there like choking on my tears, trying to explain to them that my stepdad just died yesterday. Here I am, like I don't really know, like can you give me a break? And most of them just kind of stared at me like they didn't really know like what to say or what to do. Um, Except my English teacher, funny, different person, was the only one who really acknowledged that and was like being supportive. And I felt like he understood how to show up for me in that. However, the rest of my experience was very much like, I didn't know how to navigate this. The teachers didn't know how to deal with me. Cognitively, of course, you're not really there because you're so emotionally out of it and just hardly functioning. And that impacted the way I was showing up for class. Yet the teachers didn't really know how to meet me there. So I have a couple of these different perspectives as far as like, what is it like for a kid going through this, being in our general school systems when the teachers and the students don't know how to show up for someone when they're going through that, and how that created a lot of isolation and a lot of shame and a lot of like I felt like I couldn't show up with my emotions or with my grief and I couldn't talk about it because I was being shunned
Yeah.
because it was too much for people to handle.
Yeah. They didn't know what to say or do. And I mean, that happens in our adult lives, but boy, when you're a kid, it's like, that sense of belonging is so darn important. And then to not feel like you belong. So now I have a dead dad and I'm not belonging. And now what's going to happen with me? Right. So in your experience, if you could have what it should look like, the best case scenario for a kid coming back, what would that look like? What would the environment be? What do you think needs to be set up in order to create this great environment for a grieving kid?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think my answer would differ depending on my sixth grade little Cammy's experience versus my 15-year-old experience. But I think generally the first thing that comes to mind is how I would have really liked, like I'm imagining a culture where it's not so taboo to talk about death and grief and to be emotional while you're in school and to take a break from your studies if you need to go to the bathroom and cry. I remember this one time I literally snuck out of school because I couldn't get a pass to leave and go home, and I couldn't stop crying. was having
Oh,
one of those grief days. And like I literally wasn't allowed to leave. And I was like, screw you guys, I'm ditching because I needed to go take care of myself and I got punished for it. So I think about like, well, what if these conversations were more normalized, and what if we knew how to approach a kid having this experience and knew a little bit about what their needs were like, emotionally, and how they're unable to really approach their studies in the same way. I think those are the big things with socially now. How is the kid being met in these social environments, and then academically, how is this going to affect your studies? So I think from the teacher's role, that's an important place to build that community and to open up these conversations and to bring more of this awareness, just, I think, to culture, into academics in general, to have more of these conversations, yet also to understand like you're going to have those days where you can't show up, and you're going to have those days where you can't get your homework done, and to give the kids some slack because their brains literally aren't functioning the same way. So I think there's a range of different
mm-hmm.
needs that can be set up differently. But I think a lot of it is like just address the elephant in the room. Like, don't be so afraid to talk about it. Let's sit in a circle. I'm sure so many other kids have had experiences that they feel like they can't talk about, and they feel isolated because of it,
Yep.
because our culture doesn't support that. So I'm just imagining these classroom settings and just our community and our culture in general that is okay with having the hard conversations because we have the skills on how to address the pain, how to express our emotions in a healthy way, and how to socially support one another when they're going through a hard time.
So what I'm hearing is, I mean, we have to start somewhere, and it feels like it's educating the educators, and the people that are the adults in the school system, of educating them first to get them to a comfort level of being
Right.
able to talk about this, but also bringing in their expertise of, okay, now we have different developmental stages. What would you think is the best way? And then incorporating in their curriculum. And maybe it's a part of, do we wait till someone dies? Or is that something that schools could actually bring into a curriculum? I don't know what they'd call it. But something where, because pets die,
Mhm.
parents get divorced, grandma, grandpa may die, maybe a sibling has died. Um, they moved, went from
Mhm.
one home to another. And now I'm in this new school system. It happened to you. It happened to me. There's a lot of grief. I went off the rails and just became the wild child because I didn't have, but there were many of us like that. And it's like, if we could create not just about the death of a person, but actually having some kind of curriculum for students that the educators are bringing into, like you say, let's start normalizing and having conversations. How do you create circles of support, and empathy,
Yeah.
right? And depending upon the age level, that would be really super cool. I don't have any kids, and my grandchildren are starting to, but I think I'm going to explore that a little bit and just kind of talk to my daughters-in-laws and sons, as far as what do they do for that? Because I'm thinking
Mhm.
even like my daughter-in-law and son who have foster children.
Mhm.
And what kind of support do they have in the school for these children that are taking from their home and hopefully being reunified at some point, but they're wobbly, and think about the immense grief and confusion and all of that. We have social workers, yes, but it almost feels like everybody who interacts with that kid, from the custodians of the building to, all of the educators there, to the people that are in the lunchroom, everybody who interacts with that child has some kind of training, and that you make
Mm.
this a norm in the school versus wait till something happens.
Right.
Um,
Right. And then questioning, how now what do we do about this? This big thing happened. whether it's from an individual student or whether it's on a collective level. I mean, we think about these other layers of trauma and grief that happen that on a collective level, we think about COVID and the grief that comes with how, kids and their social lives were affected. You talked
Yep.
about divorce and how changes in your family unit. Kids are bringing all of this to school with them. I mean, kids are very honest about, I'm thinking of these adverse experiences and these memories of if they have violence in their home or if they're, in a part of town where gang violence and those kinds of things is normal. And they're coming to school and having these conversations and bringing all of that with them. How do we navigate those kinds of things? If there's a student in school dies, how do we talk about that? George Floyd and all of those kinds of things. What does this mean about racism and grief and all of these different things that come up? It's like, it seems easy to just ignore it when it's not really collectively impacting
Right.
your school until it collectively impacts your school and you have to figure out how do we hold space for this.
And I know that there's programs out there, but are they short term? How do we incorporate it so it's part of the fabric? It's
Mm,
woven in on a regular basis is kind of my almost takeaway here, my passion. Like I'm going to start researching this, and I know that this is a passion of yours because you've had the lived experience. I've had it, not the death of my physical parents, at that age, but the death of their marriage and the moving of the way and all of these other things that were big grief moments for me, from that perspective. So I guess to our audience that's listening, I would really like them to reach out to us and share, especially if they're educators, what are their thoughts? Because the people that would really know, geez, we could maybe do this, or these are my thoughts. I would love to hear that because you and I are more than willing to like sit down and brainstorm and think of how can we help support programming? What can we do to help? Because it's not just going to the grief camps. It's not just our Breathe coaching model for grief and one-on-one grief coaching or that type of thing, but we're here to help collectively educate and create it so that grief is not a dirty word. It's not a bad word. Death, dying, dead is part of the circle of life. And so how can we incorporate this so that it doesn't break us?
yeah, right. And I think there's such an opportunity to utilize those experiences to grow stronger as a community, to build resilience, and to support one another in this trauma and the hardship of whatever loss it is. Like, there's so much more potential for support and for doing grief in a different way, culturally and collectively, when we can start to normalize it on a regular basis. And I think it's interesting how, I mean, I learned about algebra or whatever for however long in high school, yet I haven't used algebra. What if, and then we think about life and death and dying in this whole circle of the cycle of life that everybody's going to experience at some point. Why is this not in our curriculum? How come we don't talk about it more? And reframing that as from like a dirty or a bad or a scary thing to start building some of that resilience and strength and building out that toolbox of resources and support so that when it happens, because we know it will in some form, we feel a little bit more prepared and less chaotic and freaking out about it.
Right.
Um, yeah, so I like your idea of just like calling out all of the educators and all of the people who have also thought about this theme of, death education and grief literacy in our culture. How can we start to weave that into our everyday experience? And if anyone has any ideas or resources to share, then I would love to explore that because that's something I definitely want to continue to dive into.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow, this is good. Feels like it's just like a little capping off my weekend of grief camp, and there's just so much there. And I know that that's just a passion of yours. Is like, okay, the kiddos are, that's a great passion of yours. And so for those of you who are listening, we do want to hear from you. And maybe we're missing the boat on some of this. Maybe there's lots of good stuff happening. And then please, we're open to hear, but also how might we be able to improve upon it? Because I know that the kids that I see at camp, they're going through a lot of the same things you were going through, Cami. So it hasn't changed holistically yet. And we can only help hopefully make it better. And there's lots of people out there. There's lots of counselors that specialize in this. And how cool would it be if we could all collectively come together and really collaborate and brainstorm about how we might be able to bring this into the greater educational system.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and collaborating with everybody. This is a team effort. Like, we're all in this together.
Yep.
Everybody has their specialty. And I think about, the school, the Confident Grief Coach School, and how this breathe model for grief, how useful that would be if we could have the educators, or the support people in the educational system, if they had some training with how to hold space for grief and grief coaching, and just kind of digging into this a little bit more, how different that might be for the students who get to receive that support, and for the staff who gets to receive that support as well.
Yep. Yeah.
So yeah, if anyone out there has any ideas and wants to collaborate, let us know.
We'll take it in. We'll take it in. So awesome. Well, this was an awesome conversation, and thanks for sharing your stories and your thoughts and asking me about camp, because it's one of the things I just love to do twice a year, off to camp. And I walk away always feeling so blessed and honored that people will share their depths of feelings with us and feel safe enough to do so. And that's really what it's all about, is let's create safety from all aspects, from children to adults to all of us in between. Have that safety so that we really can explore, feel, and heal. Explore,
love
feel,
it.
and heal. Ooh, I like that. It kind of rhymed.
Beautiful. Sounds like a curriculum on grief and death and dying that we could bring.
There you go. There you go. Okay. Well, thanks, Cami, and we will talk to you next week. And thanks everybody else. And again, please, if you have any thoughts, please, please, please share them here. Share them here. You can write comments in there, and we're looking at those, and we would love to learn more. Bye-bye.